Earlier today, a competition called Transit's Next Top Funding Model took place at SFU. The Dragon's Den-style competition allowed teams to pitch funding ideas for public transit. This comes as the latest federal budget proposes to cut public transportation funding, money that was earmarked for 2026, though it's unclear how much exactly is being cut. For more on the competition and strategies to continue funding transit services, we are joined by two guests. David Cooper is the principal and founder of Leading Mobility. Good afternoon to you, David.
Thanks for having me.
And Wendy Waters is a real estate specialist and a former board member for the Urban Development Institute. Good afternoon, Wendy.
Good afternoon.
Wendy, I will start with you. What are your thoughts on the funding models brought forward by the contestants today?
It was a lot of fun. The contestants put some great work into it. They had 3 minutes to present their ideas. There was a range of ideas, from ICBC to land taxes to sales taxes to mobility contributions from employers. So there was a lot of great ideas of how we could potentially fund transit in the region.
And David, this competition, of course, comes as the federal government proposes a reduction in transit funding. What is the current demand for funding for transit? And I'm not just talking here in BC, but also across Canada.
So what's been really interesting is the Liberal government back in 2021 stood up the Canada Public Transit Fund after many years of agencies like TransLink and municipalities saying we need a dedicated transit fund so we can do a long stream plan for the types of projects we need. And all the agencies have a list where we could be shovel ready immediately and get people to jobs and buy buses and build trains. And we've lost our dedicated funding, and we don't know how much we've lost in that, but we know it's going to be a reduction because it's also pulled into other infrastructure classes. But right now, we also have a problem where the Prime Minister is using transit workers as a backdrop, where he's gone to bus manufacturing facilities in Quebec and Manitoba, and these are the people that would impact from this funding, and it gets cut. He took the Parliamentary Press Gallery to an LRT yard last week and was surrounded by transit workers that he's cutting the funding of. So we need to figure out with some clarity what exactly is going on.
And why do you think there is that sort of the two sides, that threat of cutting the funding, but also seemingly uplifting and providing exposure to the transit workers?
Well, I think part of it is that we need to, as a sector, build our case on. At the end of the day, we have thousands of people who build vehicles that are driven and operated by 65,000 workers that impact 5 million Canadians every day. And I think part of the question and the competition today was about how we operate, but TransLink has been very upfront about the demands of growth that we've needed across the region to accommodate population, to accommodate housing. You can't get if people can't get to work from where they're living. That's a big thing, and I think it's really the onus is on us and our partners in all these other sectors, from large employers, the housing sector, to really build the case on transit investment, and that's something that we're going to just really have to push now a little bit harder.
Wendy, circling back to today's event, what was one of the pitches that just really stood out to you?
One of the pitches that stood out to the judges was either 0.5% or 1% sales tax in the Lower Mainland in the TransLink region to help pay for transit. One of the reasons that stood out and what we were looking for was that it would funding models that would distribute costs equitably. We were looking for ones that would raise enough money and also that had the potential for public support. And the group that pitched the sales tax was able to point to referendums in the United States where people actually voted for a sales tax to help fund transit. So they were able to make a case that voters will actually select this one and that it could raise sufficient funds. So I thought that was one that stood out. And some of the other ones also that stood out were related to potentially using ICBC to track vehicle kilometers traveled. And for vehicles that travel more in the region, they would pay a small levy on that, as well as potentially, instead of the ICBC rebates that some of us have been getting recently, that instead of giving them to us this money back to us, to put it into TransLink or into transit itself. So those were some of the ideas that stood out.
And when it comes to viable transit funding models, what is maybe a key component, Wendy, that needs to be contained in that proposal or in that model? Sorry.
Well, I think for this competition, and I'm not an expert on transit modeling, that's just probably a question for David here. But for this particular competition, I think it was something that could get public support because at the end of the day, there's only one taxpayer. There's taxes and levies on a lot of things that we do.
Hmm.
So we were looking for something that we thought would potentially have public support, could raise the money, and that it also felt equitable. That it's not just going after one particular group in the population.
Right, not feeling like a punishment. David, the funding
Exactly.
reduction is in the Canada Public Transit Fund, and that money was earmarked for transit projects starting next year in 2026. Without that promised funding, do transit authorities have some options to sort of make up the difference besides raising fares on riders?
I think the simple answer is no. Like I still think there is going to be federal funding for transit. We just need to figure out what exactly is the requirements and the priorities and how much there is on that. At the end of the day, like the federal government will still need to be a partner on that. But if there's a reduction in funding and we want to advance things like SkyTrain extensions or the bus rapid transit program, we need to find other tools. And to maybe build on Wendy's point, like we talked about a number of different tools today that have been done elsewhere. I'll give a really good example that people here will be familiar with. There was a sales tax referendum 10 years ago in 2015. It failed. If you drive down to Seattle right now on I-5, which is one of the most congested freeways in North America, there's a brand new LRT that just opened from Linwood, which is about 20 kilometers north of downtown Seattle. That parallels the I-5. That was sales tax money that paid for that. That was the biggest tool on that. And I think if we want to, the conversation was more about addressing our service expansion from an operating funding perspective. But if we're going to get less federal funding and we want to aggressively get people on transit and accommodate the growth of this region, we're going to have even a bigger conversation on how we're going to pay for the expansion of it. And that's going to be a multitude of different tools, and how the public will stomach that. That's something that we'll need to figure out. So.
And Wendy, what are some unique, I guess, considerations that, we need to think of for a place like Metro Vancouver when it comes to coming up with a funding model?
Well, I think the one key consideration is making sure that, I'm going to go back to the housing side, but making sure that people can find a home that is in a community they love. And now I'm paraphrasing the new housing minister, so I saw her speak yesterday, but I loved it, that it's, a home that they can afford in a community they love. And by having more transit, it helps. Higher order transit helps create these hubs of activity. So it helps create new communities, more communities, makes existing communities more vibrant. And that's really important. It also allows us to build housing where people can then get on the transit, they can get to work, they can if they don't work downtown and they want to go downtown, they want to go to a sporting event, they want to go down to see Stanley Park, all of that becomes possible. So that's the importance of transit, is it's part of the overall livability of the region, and it also supports the housing choices that we need. We know we're in a housing crisis. Everyone can't live in certain neighborhoods. We've got to have more great neighborhoods in the region, and transit is a really key part of that.
Is there anywhere sort of outside of Canada, even just around the world, that you're sort of seeing these funding models or strategies that could work here in Metro Vancouver? Sorry, Wendy, that was a follow-up for you. Apologies.
Oh, okay. As I said, I was actually going to point. Sorry, I was trying to point to David on this one.
Well, we can let David answer that as well if you would like. David,
David, do you want to take this one for what's happening in transit around the world?
Yeah, there's a whole bunch of differing tools out there. Like I mentioned, sales tax is a huge part of the conversation. There was a congestion price that was put into the central parts of New York that pays for $15 billion of the transit capital that needs to be done. I think the key thing that we also need to keep our eyes on is that, we need a new funding tool by 2027 from the province. The province provided a bailout to TransLink of $312 million. It's time limited. I'm a bit concerned of promising a revenue tool and taxation to the public a year before a provincial election. So I think the sooner we actually have this conversation now, factoring that we may have less federal funding for transit and Vancouver, there's actually a report that came out last week that I authored. Vancouver is the middle of the pack for transit investment. Edmonton per capita is actually spending more per resident on transit expansion. Seattle, Toronto, Sydney, Australia, like we're falling behind. And that's something that we're gonna have to look at. And I would love to have this conversation resolved much sooner than a year before a provincial election, which then increases the risk on actually getting anything put forward on this.
I want to thank you both for joining us and appreciate your time.
Thanks for having us.
All right, thanks very much.
That was David Cooper, the principal and founder of Leading Mobility, and Wendy Waters, a real estate specialist and former board member for the Urban Development Institute.